Hi, welcome to Willie's Web, where everyone has a story. And today on my show, I have an author who's going to talk about his book. I have a singer. I hope we can get him going, get his music up. He's the young James Brown. So we're going to introduce him later on in the show. Thank you for coming.
No, thank you.
Bill Fleming.
Thank you for the opportunity.
Oh,
and I was a little nervous when I thought I had to follow James Brown. I mean, following the Godfather of Soul would be tough. It would be very tough.
Very tough.
But I met the gentleman outside. He's a dead ringer for James Brown. 40 years ago, I seen James in concert in Miami, and I mentioned an incident in Boston in my book, Code Black, about how James Brown basically saved the city of Boston from further trouble.
Yes, he did.
Yes, he did. And he never got any credit for it.
No, but I give him credit. I wrote a poem giving him credit because he definitely did. Let's talk about you. And I know that you worked for the T for over 30 years. Let's talk talk a little bit about you and your experience before we get into the book.
Well, first of all, the building we were in used to be an old power plant for the MBTA, and the elevated trains used to run by it. And my wife, Mary Ellen, who's outside, was actually a guard on the trains. And back in the day, when she rode the trains, the guard had to stand between the trains in the wintertime and stuff as the train was going down. But as far as I grew up in Dorchester, I went to Boston Tech, went to Boston State, played lacrosse at Boston State, was in the Hall of Fame. My career came to an end. I was shot in a holdup.
Wow.
I was working in a parking lot while going to school, and so that ended my career. But later on, I became a social worker. I worked down the street from here with sexually abused kids, and I've worked with many of the kids in many of the gyms, whether it was Morton Galvin, L Street over in South Boston. And after that, very active in the neighborhood, but I went down to Florida where I became a police officer in Miami, Florida for a few years before I returned to Boston where I became on the MBTA police. But what was interesting back in Florida, most of the office I worked in Liberty City, and most of the officers I worked with were African American. And they thought Boston was out of control. They would always ask me, how's Boston? Is it really out of control? Because that was back during after Boston. Well, I come back here on vacation, and everybody else would be watching Miami Vice and Don Johnson, and they said, how can you work in Miami? It's out of control. And I always used to say, picture Boston 100 degrees with the bars open until 5 in the morning. This city would be completely out of control. So,
well, I think it's probably getting that way.
Well, it's interesting how things change. When I first came on the T, it was was about 90 police officers. The T police were formed 50 years ago. And it was actually like everything else. It was over a union dispute. The Boston police were hired, were doing details, riding buses, but they wanted 2 officers to a bus, and T only wanted to pay for 1. And once they got to the border of Cambridge or Boston, they had to get off the bus because they didn't have any jurisdiction. So the decision was made to form a separate police force. So the T police, well, now about 240 officers. The transit police, which we now know is a full civil service with full jurisdiction in 175 cities and towns. And they're one of the few departments we actually have power. They had powers of police in Rhode Island because that's where the trains go. It's in the street railway police.
What year was that they decided to do, what year was that?
It was actually 50 years ago, so whatever that is, yeah.
So the transit police wasn't always around. I'm thinking they were always around.
No, they used to have a squad called the Boston B Squad, and they handled the T. But what was happening back in the day was crime was really getting out, because back in the day there were no credit cards, so everybody was carrying money. So pocketbooks were being ripped off, and there were a lot of problems on the train with fights and everything else. And that's when the decision was made to form their own separate
for the
transit police.
Wow. And I also looked at your bio, and part of your bio, you ended up being an inspector for the bombing unit.
No, I was in charge of, I was the deputy chief in charge of investigations.
Oh, okay.
And as the T expanded, they have a now explosive detection dogs, explosive unit, because what they found out, they discovered what was happening is during terrorist events, the Boston police dogs and units were so tied up that they'd be going from like a school to over to a park, and the T would be like third or fourth on the list. Well, you can't hold service, so the decision was made to form their own, and they have an excellent working relationship with the Boston police, whether it's with the canines. I was a canine officer at one time, so best partner I ever had. So
Your dog.
except for my wife. My wife's my best partner I ever had.
Oh, you had to clean that
yes,
up.
I had to clean that up. But the T has changed, and I like to say they handle everything from truancy to terrorism, and with events have changed ever since 9/11. The Marathon bombing, there was 2 MBTA police officers are shot. One Richie Donahue almost died from his wounds. He basically was.
Wow.
And another kid, Mike Adamson, was shot over at the incident of the boat.
Wow. Oh, he was there when the guy, oh my
Went
God.
to the boat, yeah. He was.
Oh, wow.
He was shot in the butt. He doesn't like to talk about it, so he never really reported.
Safe shot, right?
Yeah.
So, go ahead.
No, go ahead. You
I was going to ask you because I'm so interested in the experience and when you wrote your book, how you put a lot of that experience into your work experience into the book. So what brought about that?
Cancer. I was out of work with cancer and I was driving my wife crazy. So I had to get something to do, so I started writing the book. And also, besides the fact, this is about an incident at Broadway at St. Patrick's Day. And for the 20 years before I retired, I worked at Broadway Station, which was considered the worst place to work. Because the crowds, what happens at Broadway, they shut down the North Head House and everything else. And the crowds are just overwhelmed the station.
Wow.
And what also Broadway Station has, which a lot of people don't understand, there's a lot of abandoned tunnels in the T. And I speak about that and how the homeless and other people live in the tunnels, and they still live. But at Broadway Station right now, the abandoned tunnels have been turned into basically a Homeland Security training base, where they have actual trains and buses inside the abandoned tunnels, where the officers, everybody from the National Guard to, before I retired, the Vermont National Guard was training there. I have no idea why, unless Bernie Sanders is planning to build a subway there.
Wow.
But the FBI, everybody trains in there.
Oh, wow. Underneath what?
Right in Broadway, underneath Broadway Station, yeah.
Wow.
It's old abandoned tunnels. And in the story, what I do, I was always fascinated with the kids who hung out the pit at Harvard Square. For those of you who aren't familiar, it's a sunken emporium where all the kids used to hang around. Well, it was mostly runaways, goth kids, and everything else, and it was surrounded by Harvard University. But this is where the kids ruled, and a lot of them were what I call aerosol artists, graffiti vandals, and some of the kids could do great work.
Wonderful.
Wonderful work.
Such a waste.
Well, it was their own subculture, and they had different ways to do it. And a lot of them were also subway surfers, which people don't understand. That's when kids will ride on the top of the trains. It's a very dangerous sport. It's.
You had a story in there about one of the kids falling off of that train. So I'm sure there had to be some incidents. And I was thinking to myself when I was reading and I was telling my sister, I'm like, we always think, we don't really think about the subways as being home where people really live and they travel those tracks.
Yes, and it's actually getting for years it was the problem with the homeless was starting to. Boston was getting under control, but in the last few years, because of the opioid crisis, it's getting actually worse.
Wow.
And with the closure of the Long Island shelter, many of the homeless, and a lot of the people don't understand, a lot of the homeless some of the homeless don't like the rules. So a lot of the shelters have rules, so they prefer to live in the subway stations or live for the tracks and everything else. And I got to know a lot of the homeless, and One in particular I got to be friends with, and this is a true story. He was a former New England Patriot.
Wow.
He was, I don't know, just say his first name was Rod. He was a linebacker for the Patriots years ago. A great player, the nicest, when I tell you the nicest guy in the world, he was the nicest guy in the world. His knee went after 7 years. He lost everything, succumbed to crack, and he ended up dying of AIDS. But we used to talk in the subway. I got to be friends with him when we worked for the U.S. Census together. And that was a real tragedy, but that shows just how drugs took over his life.
It's how fragile. How fragile people's lives are. You know, from having to experience success and have it kind of taken away from you.
Oh, it's amazing. Some of the homeless we had one homeless gentleman we used to call a judge. He was a retired judge.
Wow.
He would sit there and he'd read and stuff. And you get to know a lot of the homeless and some people can't dealing with the homeless.
How was it for you? Like meeting all these people and.
If you're nice, you enjoy it.
Yeah.
I mean, I enjoyed you. And sometimes get to be. You'd have to help carry someone up 2 or 3 flights of stairs. But or take them to the shelters, and they didn't want to go to the shelters. So, I found it. They were all good people to me. Yeah.
I often like that. I like that story. One of the girl, I kind of fell in love with the one that I can't think of the character's name. She literally, and I think about the people who wear fur coats. She literally was wearing a fur coat, and she set it afire.
Yes.
I'm like,
we did have
crazy stuff happen in Harvard Square.
And there was actually a poor girl was found on the tracks there, and she had been hit by a train, and she was one of the kids. She was a really quiet girl, and actually the character of Mobius, the skinhead who actually does the terrorist attack in response to the young girl's death, as you put it, that's actually based on a civil rights case that happened on the T, where the son of a well-to-do Bostonian, I won't say his name, his father's a billionaire, attacked a few girls, and he managed to get away. We tracked him to Germany. We managed to get him back.
Wow, to Germany?
Yeah, he was hiding out there, and Richie Sullivan, one of our detectives who was assigned to Homeland Security, who is now the superintendent of police, managed to arrest him when he got back into the country.
Wow. Well, I just also want to touch on just a little for authors who are out there. What did you see as your target market? You was just writing the book. What was your plans for the book? Because we have a lot of authors out there who are looking to to get some information on how do you promote your book, that type of thing.
Well, one interesting way I promoted the book. There's a program called Books on the T. Mm-hmm. I don't know if you're familiar with it, but what you do
is... the poet? Is that the poet?
No, it's actually founded... they have different in the subway where you leave your book with a sticker on it in certain locations, and they have what they call book fairies, and people can read the books and they can leave them back there. So that's
cool.
So it worked out fine. Books on the T about the tea. And they have a website and they have a Facebook page.
Wow.
I don't do Facebook. I don't tweet. Never wink when you can nod. Never nod when you can neighbor. Don't write anything down and never go on Facebook. Too many people get in trouble when they go on Facebook.
I know, it's true.
And never tweet. And we also there was another separate thing where we got into bookstores. I forget off the top of my head how we did that, but I'm also in a couple of bookstores, but it's also on Amazon, Lulu, and other places. And actually, I was very surprised. We won the National Indie Excellence Award.
Oh, nice.
For fiction. And I also went to Las Vegas and I won a Public Safety Writers Award for third place for it. So that was the first book. And my second book is called Troubled Waters.
Troubled Water. And this is the extension of that.
Yes.
This one is Troubled Water. This is the second one. And I love that one. I love Cope.
Well, this one, Some of my friends from Dorchester.
That could have been could have been a sequel, 1, 2, 3.
The guys I grew up with in Dorchester said it was too long for them to read. They never read a book for more than 200. So shorten the next one.
So you did.
Yeah.
Very good.
But a lot of it is, and it's interesting because when people read it, the stories that are in the book, they're true, nobody would believe. And some of the stuff I made up, obviously. But a lot of it's based on actual characters that I
believe it. It's just, it shines a light on the era. It talks a lot about the era that you write it in. And it also highlights what was going on with the busing. It talks about that. But it talks about a lot of the tea issues.
On the bus, oh yeah, but since your next guest is Mr. James Brown, I did put a little blurb in the book, and I was talking about busing. The problem wasn't black or white, it was us and them. But during the days of busing, it's not like race relations were so good anywhere in the country. When Martin Luther King was shot, it took pleas from the Godfather of Soul, your next guest, James Brown, in town, for a concert in Boston to inspire calm in the neighborhoods of Boston and to forego the rioting that burned other cities to the ground. And James Brown never got any credit for that.
No, he didn't.
And it actually was a violation of his contract to do what he did, to go on WGBH TV, because he had in his contract that he would forego a ton of money if he appeared on TV, but he did it for the good of the city.
Yeah, he did.
Unfortunately, the Kevin White, the mayor at the time, didn't have a clue who James Brown was. Yeah.
I know. He goes, I'm going to get paid.
Yeah.
I remember that. He definitely was, and definitely. Is there anything you would like the viewers to know about your next appearance? Are you appearing anywhere to promote your book?
I'm probably going to go out to Las Vegas for the next Public Safety Writers Association. I did do a cable vision show in Plymouth, but right now I'm working on my third book, so I'm tied up with that. So.
Your wife must be very tired of you. She got you writing books.
She is, my wife. We met on the subway. I was doing a detail.
She's a lovely woman.
And
I met her.
She was coming up from work, and when the minute I seen her, I said I was going to marry her. So she didn't believe me, but she picked me because the pickings in the subway where she worked were pretty slim. I can tell you that much.
So he's a good catch.
Yeah.
So, all right, thank you for coming on.
Thank you.
Oh, my God, thank you, and best of luck with your book. And you're part of the AWB, so I'll definitely see you around.
Yes, and actually, I just spoke at the Braintree Public Library, too. So
you're going to be there. Cool.
Yes.
Good.
So thank you, Willie.
No, stay there. Yeah.